It was early on a Wednesday morning when the first rumblings of the much-anticipated ruling began to ripple through the political sphere. News outlets, social media feeds, and the coffee-stained desks of Capitol Hill were abuzz with anticipation. Just in, long-awaited ruling handed down by federal judge. The headline screamed across the screen. The case had been months, even years, in the making. It involved a labyrinthine legal battle, shrouded in secrecy, pitting high-profile political figures, multi-billion-dollar corporations, and public interests against one another. It was the kind of case that had all the makings of a drama, deep pockets, powerful players, and a nation hanging on every legal twist and turn. But what exactly was this case about? At first, it was difficult to pin down. The details were buried under layers of legalese and confidential briefs. But one thing was clear: the ruling had the potential to change the very fabric of American politics. The federal judge, a respected figure in legal circles, had been given the monumental task of deciding the fate of an issue that had divided the country for years. One side argued for a radical overhaul of a decades-old law that many believed was out of step with modern needs, while the other side fought desperately to preserve the status quo. By the time the court session ended, reporters scrambled to get a glimpse of the ruling, but none were allowed access to the full document just yet. What they did get were snippets, a mere taste of what was to come, and the anticipation grew. As I sat in my office, staring at my screen, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever came next would be the kind of political earthquake we'd all been waiting for. The moment the ruling went public, the floodgates opened. Senators, representatives, lobbyists, and media moguls all scrambled to stake their claims. The political class had been holding its breath for months, and now, with the judge's decision finally in hand, the fight for the narrative was on. The ruling itself was highly complex, containing layers of legal stipulations that would require hours of interpretation. But the immediate reactions told a different story, one of shock, disbelief, and opportunism. One of the key players in this saga was Congresswoman Karen Leeds, a sharp-witted and fiercely ambitious member of the House. Leeds had built a career around championing reform in the very area the case addressed. For years, she'd pushed for drastic changes to regulations that were long overdue, at least in her eyes. When the news broke, Leeds was the first to appear on every major network, grinning ear to ear, the weight of victory clearly written across her face. She wasted no time positioning herself as the voice of reason, declaring that the ruling confirmed what she had been saying all along, that the existing system was fundamentally broken and needed drastic changes. Her supporters cheered, and even her detractors grudgingly nodded in agreement. But it wasn't long before another figure made his presence known, Senator Robert Turner. Turner was the quintessential political establishment figure, with decades of service under his belt and an unrivaled ability to wield influence. His reaction was less celebratory and more measured. He cautioned against hasty decisions and painted the ruling as a potential disaster. The tension between Leeds and Turner had been brewing for years. Turner, the stalwart defender of tradition, saw the ruling as a dangerous overreach, one that could set a precedent for future rulings that eroded the delicate balance of power he'd worked his entire career to preserve. But the real shock came when the ruling mentioned a particular corporation, one with deep ties to the highest levels of government. Reformation had always been their buzzword, but behind closed doors, they had their hands in almost every aspect of the issue at play. The judge's ruling appeared to give them the green light for an expansion that would make them more powerful than ever. The revelation sent ripples through both sides of the political spectrum. Were they being played? Was the ruling truly in the best interest of the public, or had some backroom deals been struck to ensure that the largest players remained unscathed? The fallout from the ruling was swift and unforgiving. Across the country, protests erupted, fueled by outrage from both ends of the political spectrum. In Washington, the streets outside the Capitol were filled with passionate voices, each side claiming the ruling as either a victory or a grave betrayal. In the halls of Congress, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The Capitol had transformed into a battleground, with every politician, strategist, and lobbyist jockeying for position. Karen Leeds and Robert Turner found themselves at the center of a growing storm, each holding fast to their respective positions as the country watched closely. Leeds had made her move early, calling for a special hearing to explore the potential of implementing the changes endorsed by the ruling. She argued that the time for reform had come, that the status quo could no longer stand. Her allies rallied behind her, bolstered by the surge of public support that now backed her every word. The media painted her as the voice of a new generation, one that was unwilling to let tradition stifle progress. But Turner's camp was not about to let Leeds dictate the terms. Behind closed doors, he was already organizing a coalition of conservative lawmakers, making sure they had the votes to block any radical attempts at reform. He painted Leeds as reckless and naive, warning that rushing into change could lead to irreversible damage. He called on his supporters to fight for the people, positioning himself as the defender of stability in an uncertain world. Yet, it wasn't just the politicians who were divided. Business leaders, particularly from the corporate world, were split on the ruling. Some saw the decision as an opportunity, an opening to expand and solidify their power, but others were more cautious, wary of the new regulatory landscape that was slowly taking shape. There were whispers in the corridors of power about the true nature of the ruling. Had the judge's decision been impartial, or was it a carefully crafted compromise to placate the interests of the wealthy elites? The fact that the ruling had seemingly benefited the corporation with the deepest pockets and the most political sway raised a number of uncomfortable questions. Behind closed doors, Karen Leeds received a message. It was cryptic, but the implication was clear: you don't know who you're dealing with. Someone, somewhere, was warning her. But the question remained, was the threat genuine? Or was it just another tactic in the political game? The stage was set for a full-blown political crisis, and no one, not even the most seasoned players, could predict how this was going to end. As the national debate raged on, a deeper, more insidious game was unfolding in the shadows. The public squabble between Karen Leeds and Robert Turner was just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface, there were forces at play that neither side could fully comprehend. Leeds, now at the helm of the reform movement, found herself facing unexpected opposition, forces much more powerful than the senators and lobbyists she had anticipated. Late one evening, she received an unmarked envelope at her office. Inside was a single page, typed in stark, black ink: "You're playing a dangerous game, Karen. Stop now, or there will be consequences." Her first instinct was to dismiss it as a scare tactic. But as the days wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching her every move. The letters didn't stop. They came with more frequent warnings, urging her to back down, to reconsider her stance. But Leeds was not the type to be intimidated. She had spent her career fighting for change, and now was no different. But she couldn't help but feel that there was something far darker behind the threats, something beyond the usual political maneuvering. Meanwhile, Robert Turner, ever the pragmatist, started hearing murmurs from his allies. There were whispers of deals being made, of money flowing under the table to ensure that the status quo remained unchallenged. It wasn't just about preserving political power anymore. The new ruling had opened a floodgate of opportunities for certain industries that had long been in bed with political elites. Turner began to suspect that someone had orchestrated the ruling for their benefit, someone who had played both sides of the political spectrum. As he dug deeper, Turner unearthed a troubling connection. One of the corporations that stood to gain the most from the ruling was directly linked to an influential lobbying group with ties to powerful figures within the government. The same figures who had quietly supported Turner's campaign for years. Was he being used? Had his own connections been manipulated to bring about this very ruling, one that would reshape the political landscape in favor of a select few? The tension grew thicker as the days passed. Karen Leeds and Robert Turner, now both haunted by their own suspicions, realized that they were not just fighting for political control, they were fighting for the very soul of the nation. A midnight phone call from an anonymous source tipped Leeds off to something even more sinister. You don't know the full extent of their reach. The ruling wasn't just about policy. It's about something far more personal. They're in your life now. The words echoed in her mind as she hung up the phone. Leeds had crossed a line, and now there were no simple choices left. The question was no longer whether she would pass reform, it was whether she would survive the forces now aligned against her as the weeks wore on. The battle for control intensified, but something even more dangerous was brewing beneath the surface. The pressure on both Karen Leeds and Robert Turner reached a breaking point, and neither was prepared for the shocking revelation that was about to come to light. It started with a leak, a highly confidential document that made its way into the hands of investigative journalist, Claire Hammond. Hammond had built her career exposing the dark underbelly of Washington's power brokers, but this was something far more explosive than she had ever uncovered before. The leak was an internal memo from a lobbying firm tied to one of the largest corporations benefiting from the ruling. The document was damning. It outlined in chilling detail how top political figures, including Turner, had been lobbied for years to push through legislation that would ultimately lead to the very case the judge had ruled on. What was most terrifying, however, was the plan's timeline. It wasn't just about political influence, it was a calculated, decades-long operation designed to steer policy and create an unassailable corporate monopoly. The memo also detailed covert meetings, secret donations, and promises made between influential lawmakers, business leaders, and other key players, all working toward the same goal. Turner, the very man who had warned of the dangers of the ruling, was implicated in the plan. At first, Claire Hammond struggled with how to handle this revelation. The people named in the document were untouchable, powerful, influential figures who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. But as a journalist committed to truth, Claire knew she had no choice but to expose it all. The moment she published her article, the political landscape shifted. The ruling was no longer just a controversial legal decision, it was a symbol of corruption, of corporate greed infecting the very heart of the democratic system. Public outrage exploded. Citizens who had once believed in the legitimacy of the ruling now felt betrayed. Protests grew larger, fueled by the discovery that those who had championed reform might have done so not out of concern for the public, but because they were in on the game from the start. Karen Leeds, reeling from the leaks, was forced to confront her own role in the larger narrative. Had she been manipulated by the very people she had fought against? She had built her platform on the promise of reform, but now it seemed as though she had played right into the hands of the corporate interests that had orchestrated the entire affair. Was she part of a larger conspiracy, or had she simply been naive? Meanwhile, Robert Turner, already under fire for his close ties to the industries benefiting from the ruling, was now facing an existential crisis. His political career, built on the idea that he was the defender of American values, was crumbling. The people who had once trusted him were beginning to turn on him, accusing him of being part of a corrupt system he had sworn to fight against. But the worst was yet to come. The deeper Hammond dug into the investigation, the more chilling it became. There were rumors of even darker forces at play, forces with ties to foreign entities, organized crime, and money laundering. The scope of the conspiracy seemed to stretch beyond anything they had imagined. For Leeds and Turner, the fight was no longer about political ideology. It had become a fight for their lives. As the walls closed in on them, they were forced to ask themselves, had they been pawns in a game they couldn't even see, or were they just two players caught in a power struggle that was far bigger than anything they could control? As the storm of revelations and public outrage reached its peak, Karen Leeds and Robert Turner found themselves in the same perilous situation, caught between the wreckage of their careers and the shadowy forces that had set this entire sequence in motion. The national mood had shifted from outrage to something far darker, disillusionment. The public had been played, and they were furious. The media frenzy was relentless. Hammond's exposé had sparked a wildfire of investigations, and every major news outlet had joined in the hunt for more answers. Across the country, political analysts, pundits, and everyday citizens were dissecting every word of the leaked memo, and the names of the implicated politicians, including Turner and Leeds, were plastered across headlines. Karen Leeds, who had once stood as the symbol of change, now found herself at the mercy of the very forces she had sought to challenge. A town hall she had scheduled to speak directly to her constituents was cancelled after a series of threats, the most chilling being an anonymous message left on her phone: "You're not safe. Step down before it's too late." Leeds didn't know who had sent the message, whether it was a political rival or someone with far more sinister motives, but the fear it instilled in her was real. She had never felt so alone. Yet, despite the threats, she refused to back down. If there was one thing she had learned over the years, it was that she couldn't give up. Not now. Not when so many people were counting on her. Meanwhile, Robert Turner found himself cornered on all sides. His carefully crafted image as the protector of American values was in tatters. His political allies were abandoning him one by one, eager to distance themselves from the scandal. Public opinion had turned so drastically against him that even his most loyal supporters were now questioning his integrity. Turner had always believed that power came from control of the narrative, control of the game. But now, it seemed that he had lost control of everything. And the more he tried to salvage his reputation, the more the scandal seemed to spiral out of his grasp. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, Turner was not ready to go quietly into the night. He began to dig into the case in ways that no one had before. If the ruling was truly as corrupt as it appeared, there had to be a trail of evidence that led to the puppet masters behind it all. His goal was simple: find out who had orchestrated the ruling, expose them, and reclaim his position as the man who could restore order to the chaos. Karen Leeds, meanwhile, was not just fighting for her career, she was fighting for her survival. She had started to suspect that the deeper conspiracy might involve figures far more dangerous than anyone had initially realized. There were powerful forces, both political and financial, who had more to lose from exposure than she could imagine. Some of the whispers she'd received, though cryptic, were starting to make sense. If she could unravel the full extent of the conspiracy, she could not only clear her name but expose the real culprits. And then, just when it seemed that the world was closing in on them both, the next bombshell dropped. A new whistleblower came forward, a high-ranking figure within the lobbying group tied to the corporation that had benefited from the ruling. This whistleblower claimed to have access to a trove of documents that could tie the conspiracy together. And, most shockingly of all, the whistleblower claimed to know the identity of the one person who had orchestrated the entire plot. Leeds and Turner, once bitter rivals, now found themselves on the same side. They had no choice but to work together, however reluctantly. The game had changed. It was no longer about politics, it was about survival. But would they be able to expose the truth before those who had been pulling the strings silenced them for good? The whistleblower's information was a game changer. The documents he provided were a treasure trove of damning evidence, communication logs, financial records, and an intricate network of connections between corporate elites, government officials, and shadowy figures. But the most important piece of the puzzle was the name that appeared repeatedly at the heart of the conspiracy: Benjamin Hollis. Benjamin Hollis was not a name most Americans were familiar with, but those who worked in Washington knew him all too well. He was a behind-the-scenes kingmaker, a financier with deep ties to the highest echelons of power. Hollis had never been publicly involved in politics, yet it was clear from the documents that he had used his vast wealth and influence to pull the strings of both major political parties for years. His goal was simple: to create a system where his corporate interests could thrive unchecked, and the political landscape would bend to his will. As Karen Leeds and Robert Turner sifted through the documents, they were struck by how masterfully Hollis had played them both. Leeds had been used as the public face of reform, a champion of change who would push through the very legislation that Hollis wanted. Turner, on the other hand, had been kept in the dark, used as a pawn to maintain the illusion of balance, all the while his efforts to block the reforms were carefully calculated to keep the public in the dark about the real agenda. The truth hit them like a hammer: they had both been played. For days, Leeds and Turner argued over their next move. Both had political careers to save, reputations to salvage. But the more they thought about it, the more they realized that this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the entire political system, the very soul of the democracy they had sworn to serve. If Hollis's plan succeeded, it would usher in a new era of corporate oligarchy, one where no law or regulation would stand in the way of corporate greed. They knew they couldn't do this alone. The clock was ticking, and Benjamin Hollis was already moving his pawns into place to silence anyone who threatened his empire. With the new evidence in hand, Leeds and Turner made a risky decision. They would go public with everything. They would risk it all, expose Hollis, his network, and the corrupt system that had enabled it. But the moment they made that decision, the first threat arrived. A mysterious figure left a message on Leeds's office voicemail: "Stop digging, or this will be the last thing you ever do. You're both expendable." Despite the danger, Leeds and Turner knew there was no turning back. They called an emergency press conference, one that would be broadcast live to millions across the country. It was their only chance to ensure that their message reached the public before Hollis and his allies could take action. The night before the press conference, as they prepared for the broadcast, Turner received an unexpected phone call. It was Claire Hammond, the journalist who had blown the lid off the scandal in the first place. "There's something you both need to know," she said, her voice tense. "Hollis isn't just playing a political game anymore. He's moving faster than we thought, and he has people in place who will do whatever it takes to stop you. You need to be prepared. Whatever you think you know, there's more, much more." The line went silent for a moment before Hammond continued. "He's not just trying to win this fight. He's trying to destroy you both." Leeds and Turner exchanged a look, the weight of the situation finally settling in. The stakes had never been higher. It was no longer just about exposing corruption, it was about survival. At dawn the next day, as the world awaited the press conference, Karen Leeds and Robert Turner stood side by side, knowing that the moment of truth had arrived. The people would decide whether they were heroes or villains, but for the first time in months, they both felt a sense of clarity. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about saving the country from the corruption that had run too deep for too long. And as the cameras turned on, they stepped into the light, ready to risk everything to bring Benjamin Hollis's empire crashing down. The press conference was set to take place at 10 a.m. sharp, and by 9:45, the Capitol lawn was already crowded with reporters, cameras, and flashing lights. The world was watching, waiting for the bombshell that Karen Leeds and Robert Turner promised to drop. This was their moment, no more secrets, no more games. As Leeds and Turner walked up to the podium, the air was thick with anticipation. Both had been through hell to get to this point, and they knew that exposing the truth would come with dire consequences. The stakes had never been higher. Leeds, standing beside Turner, took the microphone first. She cleared her throat, her voice steady but unmistakably strained. "Good morning," she began, pausing as the room fell into complete silence. "Today, I stand before you not just as a representative of the people, but as a citizen of this nation, one who believes that we have reached a breaking point. What you're about to hear is not just a scandal, it is the revelation of a corruption that runs so deep, it threatens the very fabric of our democracy." The crowd leaned in, the tension palpable. Turner stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly, though his voice remained firm. The legal case that has been at the center of this political firestorm was never just about policy. It was about power. The power of a man named Benjamin Hollis, and the empire of corporate greed he has quietly built behind closed doors. For years, Hollis has manipulated the system, pulling strings from the shadows to ensure that his interests came first, at the expense of the American people. A murmur spread across the crowd. Hammond's earlier exposé had already revealed part of the story, but now, Leeds and Turner were about to connect the dots, exposing a web of corruption that spanned across both parties, every branch of government, and some of the most powerful corporations in the world. "We have the proof," Leeds continued, holding up a folder full of documents. "The evidence is irrefutable. The judge's ruling was no accident. It was the culmination of years of covert lobbying, shady backdoor deals, and threats that have silenced anyone who tried to stand in Hollis' way. And we're here to tell you, it ends now." As Turner spoke, a sudden commotion at the back of the crowd drew attention. A black SUV had pulled up, and out stepped a man in a dark suit, a man who Leeds and Turner instantly recognized. It was one of Hollis's top operatives, a fixer who had been rumored to handle the dirtiest of business for the corporate magnate. The presence of the man sent a chill down both their spines. Were they too late? Had Hollis already set the wheels in motion to shut them down? But Leeds was undeterred. She pressed on. Today, we make a stand. This is not just a fight for political reform, it is a fight for accountability. It is a fight for the future of this country, a future where our laws cannot be bought and sold by the highest bidder. We will not allow our government to be hijacked by corporate interests. We will fight to restore integrity to the system. The press room erupted in questions, but Leeds and Turner stood firm, their message clear. For a moment, there was silence. Then, as if on cue, the power in the room flickered. The cameras blinked off, the lights dimmed. A few gasps echoed from the reporters, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. The fixers had arrived. Before anyone could react, the doors burst open, and a group of armed men, dressed in dark suits, stormed into the room. It happened so fast, too fast for anyone to process. There was a flash of panic, but just as quickly, the doors slammed shut, cutting off any escape. "Mr. Hollis sends his regards," one of the men said, his voice cold and final. Leeds and Turner, their backs against the podium, knew what was coming. This was the endgame. But there was no turning back now. But then, an unexpected twist. The lights flickered again, and the sound of sirens blared in the distance. Outside, a massive crowd had gathered, drawn by the live broadcast of the press conference. The protests that had erupted across the nation were now converging on the Capitol, and the people were demanding justice. As the sound of the crowd grew louder, the armed men hesitated. They had been trained to silence, to intimidate, but they hadn't expected this. The people were here. And they were not going to back down. In that split second of hesitation, Turner made his move. With one swift motion, he grabbed the microphone and shouted into it, "This isn't just about us. It's about you. This is your country, your future. We won't let them take it from us." The crowd outside roared in response, their voices a tidal wave of fury. It was in that moment that the walls of power, built over decades of corruption, began to crack. The fixers backed away, their mission clearly failing. Leeds and Turner, driven by the weight of their decision and the support of the people, stood tall. Their gambit had paid off. The truth had been exposed. But the war was far from over. Benjamin Hollis would be forced to answer for his actions, and the world would soon know the full extent of his manipulation. As for Leeds and Turner, their careers may never be the same, but they had fought for something more important than themselves. They had fought for the soul of the nation. And in the end, they won.